A few days ago, I was trying to think of a game to cover for my next video, and I wasn't having any luck thinking of anything new to cover. It was during my daily 6-hour binge of Yakuza Kiwami that I thought about the series' use of the Club Sega Arcade, and how a bunch of cool Sega games are ready to be played whenever you want. One franchise included in Yakuza is Virtua Fighter, and seeing as Virtua Fighter 5 Ultimate Showdown runs on the same engine as the modern Yakuza games, I thought that another Virtua Fighter video was a great idea. I've covered the first and fifth games in the Virtua Fighter series, so I wanted to return to Virtua Fighter 4, as I spent lots of time playing this game as a kid a long time ago. While Virtua Fighter may not seem like it innovates too much outside of graphical fidelity with every new release, I would argue that Virtua Fighter 4 is not only one of the most impactful fighting games ever, but I'd also throw in that it's one of the most impactful arcade games ever. I'm aware that this is a bold claim, especially considering the series never really took off like how its cousins Tekken and Street Fighter did in terms of popularity, but I hope to show you why I think this is the case throughout the video, as well as to provide a general overview of the game and why I like it. Without further ado, let's Tetsuzanko our way into 2001's Virtua Fighter 4. First off, let's dive into the character roster. Virtua Fighter 4 contains 14 playable characters, with series mainstay Dural needing to be unlocked. 14 characters may not seem like many by today's standards, and when you compare it to other fighting games that also released in 2001, like Tekken 4 and Super Smash Bros. Melee, it may seem like Sega skimped out on the roster a bit, but luckily, Virtua Fighter's gameplay is more than deep enough to make up for this, and we'll get into it a bit later. Classic characters like Akira, Pai-chan, Wolf Hawkfield, and Sarah and Jackie Bryant all make a return, as well as other series mainstays, and new characters Lei Fei and Vanessa Lewis aim to breathe some new life into the series. Lei Fei is a Chinese monk who fights with Shaolin Ken, a real fighting style that's one of the oldest forms of Kung Fu in Chan Buddhism. Lei Fei will be truly appreciated by hardcore fighting game fans and Wu-Tang Clan enthusiasts alike, as he effortlessly brings Shaolin-style fighting to life with his expressive and realistic animations. Notice how I said that Lei Fei will do it effortlessly, not you. This is because he has 5 different stances, all with different poses and moves for you to remember. I'm not even going to try and pronounce any of these apart from standard, but the skill and muscle memory required to optimally use Lei Fei is staggering. The other new character is Vanessa. She can switch between 2 stances, defensive and Muay Thai, to either be an all-rounder character who can grab and parry enemy attacks, or to sacrifice a bit of damage to attack the enemy with blinding speed. Virtua Fighter has always provided a nice variety of realistic fighting styles, and Virtua Fighter 4 is no different. From Baji Chuan, Pro Wrestling, Pancration, Jeet Kune Do, and Guile, every single character feels different from one another, and this is awesome. A diverse character roster is really cool to have, but is the gameplay any fun? Heck yeah, it's fun. As a disclaimer, I am in no way a Virtua Fighter expert as I play 3D fighting games like a blind kitten, but I'll do my best to accurately describe the game's mechanics. To start, we have the basics. If you don't know, Virtua Fighter is a 3-button fighter, with punch, kick, and guard being your moves. You can also freely walk in 8 directions. Double tapping up or down will give you an evasive maneuver used to dodge enemy attacks, and it's kind of like sidestepping in Tekken. If you're looking for more advanced defensive techniques, then you're in luck, because Virtua Fighter 4 is home to Inashi and Sabaki. These 2 moves are similar, but they have some differences. According to VFDC, Inashi is a parry or deflection. The Inashi typically does little to no damage, and instead of knocking down the opponent, it results in a stagger. And Sabaki are regular attacks or motions with attack deflection properties. The main difference between Sabaki and reversal/Inashi is that the Sabaki will always animate regardless of the opponent's action, whereas a reversal or Inashi will only activate when it connects successfully against an opponent's attack. Sabakis can be further classed into 2 types, attack or reversal. Sabaki attacks are, as the name suggests, normal attacks which have deflection properties. Sabaki reversals are simply motions which will reverse an opponent's attack, usually with no damage. The reason they're not called Sabaki Inashi is because the opponent isn't staggered as a result, and thus cannot recover from the situation. If fighting game minutiae like that bores you, then stay away from Virtua Fighter, because this series is as technical as it can get. You can have fun button mashing with the game's pick up and play nature at lower levels, but at higher levels of play, you pretty much have to be a living Virtua Fighter encyclopedia in order to win. Another important detail is how stages work. Virtua Fighter 3 went the Tekken 4 route, including stages with uneven terrain. This was a big departure from the flat sumo-style arenas from the first two games, and after lukewarm reception to the change, Sega made the stages flat again in Virtua Fighter 4. However, one more change they made to the game involves fences. You can juggle opponents into them, or even fling them over for a ring out. I could go on and on and on for days about Virtua Fighter 4's gameplay, as there's truly an astounding level of detail and complexity present, but I don't want to bore you anymore, so let's move on to what content the game has to offer. Virtua Fighter 4's PS2 port contains Arcade Mode, a gauntlet with 13 fights with a bonus fight with Dural at the end, Versus, where you can fight another person, Kumite, a mode where you keep fighting until you eventually lose or quit, Training, which homes command training, a mode where you perform a character's entire move list, Free Training, where you can train however you like, and Trial, which acts as a tutorial to help new players wrap their heads around the fighting system. AI system involves you fighting against an AI character and watching it get better over time. The closest comparison I can think of are, oddly enough, amiibo figures for Smash Bros. They both feature virtual characters that start off weak, but grow to contain their own tendencies and strategies as you play with them. AI system is fun at first, but you quickly realize that this won't actually help you learn the game, as while the enemy does grow stronger over time, they'll never truly behave like a human being. Data files lets you make a new player profile, which is where your save data goes, and replay lets you watch replays. It's not a lot overall, but at least the tutorial is excellent. Considered to be arguably the greatest fighting game tutorial ever made, Sega really wanted new players to properly understand and appreciate the game mechanics, and they pulled it off splendidly. It takes just over half an hour to complete, and you'll emerge a changed fighting game player after completing it. The game's content is cool, I'm not going to complain about it, but this next point is pretty nerdy, I'll admit, but I wanted to get into it. What does the game run on? Virtua Fighter 4 was released in August of 2001 for arcades around the world. I've gotta say, for a game that's over 20 years old, it still looks pretty good. This is due to the wizards at Sega making the game run on their Naomi 2 arcade board. Other games like Virtua Striker 3 and Initial D Arcade Stage use this board, but in terms of the visuals, Virtua Fighter 4 definitely takes the cake in my eyes. Featuring all this technical mumbo-jumbo I'm too dumb to truly appreciate, the board was able to make Virtua Fighter look even better than before, which was no easy feat. A year later, in 2002, the game came out on PlayStation 2. Hooray, right? Well, not for Sega, as the PS2 was a lot weaker than their arcade board, so their problem was making the game still look good at a frame rate of 60 frames a second on weaker hardware. The big problem I noticed when recording gameplay footage was the anti-aliasing. After doing some digging, I found that there's been a debate about the PS2 version supposedly running at half the resolution of the arcade version, and this caused some graphical downgrades from the arcade release. I couldn't find a definitive source to prove if this was the case or not, but what I do know for a fact is that there are some downgrades to be found, like the reduced lighting, particles, less detailed shadows, and aliasing, among other things. It's hard to notice since I've upscaled the game into 1080p for the purpose of this video, but hey, at the end of the day, the game still looks great no matter what you play it on. Most arcade games simply didn't look nearly as good as this back in the day, and this was a huge part of Virtua Fighter's design philosophy, to innovate. One more thing I'd like to touch on is why I think the game is so impactful: its use of the internet. It's safe to say that back in 2001, the internet was nowhere near as big as it is today, but that didn't stop Sega from incorporating it into the game. While you couldn't play online against other players directly, the game featured what was known as character access cards. These were physical cards that you would purchase from an arcade, and it would host your fight statistics like your wins and losses, as well as your rank and cosmetics. Cards like this for arcade games are dime a dozen in the present day, what with Nasika cards taking off in Japan, but something like this back in the early 2000s was simply unheard of. Sega also launched a website called VF.net, which gave players the opportunity to make an account and manage their in-game data online. This is some pretty cool stuff to have in an arcade game, especially one that was released in a time when most people around the world didn't even have access to broadband. Hell, I wasn't even alive back in 2001, or 2002 for that matter, so this resonates with me personally as to how technologically advanced Sega were back in the day. Like the Dreamcast, Virtua Fighter 4 was way ahead of its time, but unlike this system, Virtua Fighter 4 didn't crash and burn financially. Details about the arcade version sales are hard to find, but Japanese magazine and newsletter Game Machine stated in their September 15th, 2001 issue that Virtua Fighter 4 was the most successful game of the month in Japan. IGN employee Anthony Chow wrote in his article about the game that it is one of the finest looking video games I've laid my eyes on, and that it demonstrates the highest quality in visuals I've seen. Once the game hit the PS2 in 2002, Japanese gamers ate it up, and it turned out that in its first weekend on sale, the game had sold 500,000 copies, making it Sega's fastest selling game of the PS2 generation. By the end of 2002, the game had sold 541,973 copies in Japan alone, and if we're talking about worldwide figures, the game made even more money for Sega, as by June 2002, the game had sold over 1.5 million copies. Skipping forward a bit to July 2006, Virtua Fighter 4 had sold 630,000 copies in the United States, making a total of $23 million. The game sold amazingly well, and was a huge success for Sega, and not only were sales figures great, the reviews were too. The game has a 94 on Metacritic, making it one of the best PlayStation 2 games ever made. Japan's Famitsu gave the game a 37 out of 40, and Western outlets like G4 TV and official PlayStation magazine gave the game perfect 10 out of 10 scores. The Chicago Tribune said that Virtua Fighter 4 is the greatest fighting game since Street Fighter 2. After reading about all this during my research, I came to the conclusion that maybe, I have a slight hunch, I could be wrong, call me crazy, but I think that critics like the game. Sega weren't finished however, as in 2003 they released Virtua Fighter 4 Evolution, an update to the game that introduced 2 new characters and balance changes for the returning characters, as well as better anti-aliasing, the much-loved quest mode, an improved ranking system and new gameplay modes just to name a few. Evolution has a 93 on Metacritic, so critics loved this game as well. If you bought the American PS2 release of Evolution, you also got Virtua Fighter 10th Anniversary, an updated version of the first game with the gameplay of Evolution. I made this video to look back at a very old Sega fighting game, one that I still think is more fun than some modern fighting games. I hate to say this, but I see Virtua Fighter as a whole to be less popular than it was back in the day, at least outside of Japan. Reading about and playing Virtua Fighter 4 again reminded me of when Sega was a powerhouse of the fighting game industry, and I wanted to time travel back to that period and remember this game in all its glory. Thanks for watching, I hope you learned something, and I'll see you in the next one.